Intuitive eating is a self-care eating framework that integrates instinct, emotion, and rational thought. And it's made up of 10 different principles that all work together to help us eat in a way that is satisfying for our body, but also provides for all the energy needs of the body, while at the same time ensuring that we're not excessively overeating habitually. So it's a beautiful framework that can really help us to establish a really positive relationship with food. Now, within that framework, there are a couple of principles: honor your hunger and feel your fullness, that I find to be very practical. But often when you hear just, hey, honor your hunger and feel your fullness, that doesn't really help much, right? What does it mean to honor your hunger? What does it mean to feel your fullness? How do we know when we are overly hungry? Or how do we know when we are over full versus just comfortably full? How do we assess that? Is there a way that we can quantify that to some degree? Well, there is. There's a great tool called the Hunger and Fullness Scale. My name is Jeff Ash, certified nutritionist, personal trainer, and intuitive eating coach, and you're listening to the Men's Intuition Podcast. In today's episode of the podcast, I'm going to be sharing an exciting resource from my new course called Equipped to Thrive. Now, this Equipped to Thrive course is an intuitive eating course that takes you through all of the principles of intuitive eating, but it doesn't just teach you about intuitive eating. It helps you to begin to implement each one of those principles in your own eating on a daily basis. So I'm really excited to be releasing that at the beginning of February in 2023. Now, this is one of the supplemental resources that goes along with the lesson on hunger and fullness. And it's designed to be a tool to help you to then implement those principles of honoring your hunger and feeling your fullness. And so in today's episode, I will be sharing that with you right here on the podcast. All right, so we have talked about hunger and fullness, and now it's time to talk about how we can actually implement that into our daily life. Now, over time, you'll get to a place where you're not necessarily consciously thinking about your hunger levels or your fullness levels. It will just become much more natural, much like driving a car. You know, early on, it was somewhat difficult. You had to think about all of the different things that you needed to do in order to drive that car properly. But over time, it became second nature, and you can have conversations with people in the car. You can zone out even and still safely drive from one location to another because it becomes very natural and automatic. And the same will happen with your hunger and fullness. But this tool that we're going to be talking about today, the Hunger and Fullness Scale, will really help you to begin to implement that so that it can become an unconscious habit in many ways. Now, the Hunger and Fullness Scale is a scale from 0 to 10 to help you rate your hunger and fullness level. Now, we don't just stop there and say, hey, rate your hunger and fullness on a scale of 0 to 10. That wouldn't be particularly helpful, right? We need to know, well, what's a 0? What's a 1? What's a 2? What's a 10? Now, if you're just listening to this via audio, you'll want to make sure that you take a look at the Hunger and Fullness Scale along with it. So if you're watching the video, obviously you'll see that come up on the screen. But if you are just listening in the background, you probably want to at least have this Hunger and Fullness Scale in front of you as we kind of work through it together here. Now, the Hunger and Fullness Scale, off to the left, you can see there that I have it labeled as over hungry, that particular range. Another range that I call an ideal eating range. And then the other range that we can talk about as being over full. Now, in the over hungry range, that would be your ratings of 0 to about 2. And if we think about it, a rating of 0 means painfully hungry, very urgent, intense, basically as hungry as you can get, right? And that's not a very comfortable feeling. I think any of us who have been in that situation, when we find ourselves in that situation of being that hungry, it is not comfortable, and there's a lot of urgency involved. But then we get to rating number 1, which is ravenous to eat, irritable and anxious. So we're still quite hungry, maybe not painfully hungry, but we're hangry maybe, right? We're ready to eat. We're getting irritable. We're really starting to think, when's dinner going to be ready? When, this kind of thing. And then that brings us to the rating level of 2, which is very hungry, looking forward to a good sized meal or snack. And so that may be where you're really anxious to get food going, but it's not painful yet. But you can see that we're really starting to get there. Now, if you think about those three, all three of those give us a little bit of a sense of urgency, and we want to eat as soon as possible, right? And what we find is that when we arrive at a meal or a snack time with that level of hunger, it can be difficult to choose foods that we know are going to suit our body well in that moment. It also makes it very easy to disconnect from the eating experience because we find ourselves eating very quickly. We're so hungry that we don't take time to savor, to taste, to chew the food. I know myself personally, if I find myself in that situation, I often eat very quickly and then my stomach gets upset and I start burping a lot and, things like that. So there's all kinds of things that make us not feel particularly good, while at the same time, we're not really connected with our hunger in that moment. We're almost eating in a very disconnected way. And eating can feel very chaotic, a bit out of control and that kind of thing. So we want to try and eat when we are not really in that range. We not let ourselves get quite to that range if possible. Of course, things happen, but it's good to just understand that that's not necessarily the ideal range to be eating in. Now, when we get to the ideal range, or what we would call an ideal range, this is kind of your 3 through 7 as far as your hunger scale is concerned. And so the 3, it's hungry, ready to eat, but not urgent. Now, this is a great place to be when you arrive at a meal. Think about the time when you get to a meal, you're hungry, you're not starving, there's no urgency, you're perfectly fine waiting a few more minutes. You can take time, sit down, put your napkin down, have a drink, whatever. And then you can cut into your food and you can eat it and chew it. You can savor it. You can enjoy the flavors, the smells, all of those kinds of things. But because you are pretty hungry, you can enjoy it because it's very satisfying to take in that food when you're hungry. But at the same time, there's not that urgency. So you're able to stay connected with that eating experience. Then there is the level 4, subtle hunger, slightly empty. And that may be how you arrive at a meal too. Still a satisfying way to eat. Nothing wrong with that. But that may also be where you start to get as you start eating part of your meal. So maybe you got there at a level 3, you start eating and you start hitting a level 4. And then 5 would be kind of neutral. You're not really hungry or full. And so you're not necessarily ready to stop eating, but you're not really feeling hungry anymore either. Now at a 6, we're beginning to feel, an emerging feeling of fullness, right? This is where we're starting to feel full. And that for you may be a comfortable place to stop eating for whatever reason. And that's a good thing to keep in mind. How comfortable do you feel when you're there? Do you like to eat to where you're approaching fullness rather than being full? And each one of us is going to be a little bit different in that. And so this is where you can start to figure out what works best for you, what feels best to you. At a 7, this is where we're comfortably full, satisfied, content. And so for each of us, again, the feelings that we experience are going to be very different from one person to another. The amount of food that's required to get even 2 people of the same body size and shape are going to experience this sensation at a different place. And so it's important that we find how that describes it for us as a unique individual. Now we start getting into the overfull. And this is where you have your 8, which is a little too full, but not necessarily all that unpleasant yet. So this is maybe something like when you go out to dinner, you go ahead and eat a little more food, you eat a little past fullness because it's a place that you don't normally eat. It's food that you're really enjoying. Maybe you've somewhat disconnected from the food a little because you got distracted by some social interactions and those kinds of things. Maybe you had, I had Mexican food yesterday and I did eat probably a few more chips than I needed to, which left me a bit fuller at the end of the meal, but not, I didn't eat a huge amount, but I recognized afterward, I probably ate a little bit more past fullness. So I probably hit about an 8 there. And, but it was fine. I wasn't uncomfortable by any means. But again, it's good for us to recognize that so that we can be curious and figure out what's going to work best for us. At a 9, then, this is where we start feeling too full. And I've experienced this. I think all of us have. You're feeling a bit uncomfortable. Your pants are feeling snug. And you get up from the table and you're, it's just, the difference between leaving a table content, satisfied, and comfortably full, and then leaving over full and kind of like a little uncomfortable, that makes a big difference in the enjoyment of the eating experience. And then that takes us to 10, which is up at the top of the list, and that's painfully full and stuffed, and you may even feel nauseous. And this is the This is the place where we find ourselves when we've just significantly overeaten beyond really what our body can handle processing at the moment. That's really the problem, is that our body can just process so much at one time. And when we give it too much, it just leaves us not feeling particularly great. And if you think about it, that takes away from the satisfying nature of that meal. It takes away from the experience if it was a celebration or a social event. If you leave that meal needing a Tums or, or something, or just to go lay down because you're not feeling well, that's not a place that we want to find ourselves consistently. And so as we went through that scale, hopefully you find you're seeing some ways that could be really beneficial in helping you to reconnect with that hunger and fullness. And the reason that I bring this up is because so many of us have disconnected from our hunger and fullness cues. And many clients that I've worked with have arrived at a place where they said, okay, I know when I'm starving, but I don't really know when I'm comfortably full. I know when I'm really stuffed, when I've had too much, but I don't know anything in between. So I know when I'm starving, I know when I'm uncomfortably full, but where's that middle ground, that comfort level, where we're eating the amount of food that feels good while also being the right amount of food for the energy needs of the body. And so I think this will help you with that. Now let's talk just briefly here about when to use it. So if you're just starting out, I would highly recommend you just try this at one meal. Just pick a meal, but pick a meal where you are able to stay connected with that meal. It may be one that you eat alone so that you can kind of practice it in the moment without distractions from the kids or office colleagues or whatever the case may be. So you can just kind of focus on it and try it out that way the first time. Take a meal and then try and rate your hunger as you go into that meal. And then what you may do is pause in the middle of the meal just for a moment and say, okay, where's my hunger now? So maybe you went in and you were like, yeah, I was ready to eat. I was hungry and this is tasting great. And you get in there and you're eating and you're halfway through your plate. And then you just pause and say, where am I now? Am I neutral, not hungry, not full? Am I starting to get full? Am I stuffed already? And that kind of a thing. And then you can then later on toward the end of the meal, when you do decide to stop eating, you can check in again with your body and say, hey, where am I at now? That can be a really good practice to implement. It's not something that you have to spend a lot of time doing. Just pause for a moment, check in, see, and then go about your business. Now, if you're a journaler or you like to do that kind of a thing, you might keep a journal on how your hunger and fullness is between meals. Certainly not if it's going to cause any kind of obsessive thoughts or something that you're going to start using as a new rule kind of a thing, but just something to mindfully track kind of how you are recognizing your hunger and fullness. A lot of people find that to be really helpful. Now, you may get to a place too where once you've done that at a single meal, you may want to try it at all your meals over the course of a day. You may also want to do this at different points during the day when you're not eating. So you might check in at 10 o'clock in the morning, sometime between breakfast and lunch. Check in with yourself and say, where am I at as far as my hunger level? You may check in and say, man, I'm kind of neutral. I'm not really hungry or full. Cool, I can continue going. Or you may stop, pause for a moment and realize, wow, I am super hungry. Now, what you can do then is then have a snack. That would be one thing. But you can also use that and make sure that this is done from a neutral point of curiosity. You can also say, well, what did I have for breakfast? And that's when you can start to go back and say, okay, well, at breakfast, it was super light. I didn't have much. All I had was a piece of fruit. And so you realize, okay, you know what? Maybe that's why I'm super hungry here mid-morning. Maybe tomorrow I'll try and add something to my breakfast to make it a bit more sustaining, to carry me over a little bit better over the course of the morning. And so again, we can use this hunger scale to not only rate our hunger and start to connect with our hunger so we can honor it, as well as recognize our fullness so that we can respect that as well. But we can use this to help us to better put together our eating over the course of the day in a way that's going to keep our appetite in those comfortable ranges throughout the day. And it's amazing, when you don't let yourself get super hungry over the course of the day, that leaves you energy to focus on the other things that are important to your day. So if you find yourself ravenously hungry in the middle of a meeting at work, it can be very distracting. Take your mind off of what needs to be accomplished there. But if you're consistently feeding yourself well over the course of the day, then you'll find that that leaves, again, more energy, more brain space to focus on those other important areas of your life. All right, so I hope you found that resource helpful. If you'd like to learn more about the Equipped to Thrive course, definitely go check out hopedrivesme.com. That's my website. And there you can find all the information about the Equipped to Thrive course and also the Equipped to Thrive men's community group as well. You can also follow me over on Instagram at intuitive.eating.men. And I'd love to hear from you in a DM as well. Feel free to reach out to me in a DM. Let me know if you've tried implementing this hunger and fullness scale and how that worked out. I'd love to hear.